actually do have a shorter than usual presentation because I knew I was going last, and these things always run long. So, and I even wrote down the rambly bit instead of just letting myself ramble. I'll just read it and get through it, so this will be good. So I decided to start with the overview. I think a lot of you did as well. And I wish now that I organized it a little bit better, having had the past several hours to rethink it. Yeah, I've had some second thoughts. But I did want to just start off by talking about what I've been doing most, with most of my time over the past few months is working on my book, Digital Playgrounds, The Hidden Politics of Children's Online Play Spaces, Virtual Worlds, and Digital Games. And it's basically an overview of the past 10 years of children's online games and play spaces, and that's about how long I've been researching this area, which is kind of awesome and shocking at the same time. And as if you kind of think back to previous talks today, and for those of you who are aware of online gaming, you know that over the past decade there have been a lot of really huge major advances in online gaming. I mean, from being able to play with other people to being able to play with other people in these 3D virtual environments, these persistent always-on worlds, massively multiplayer online games. World of Warcraft is one that you hear a lot about, and various others. And there's a lot of work that's been done in this area, examining all these different amazing things that are happening in and around these spaces, and the ways that people construct community around it, and the economics and political and economics of that as well. But what's missing from a lot of the academic work in this area are children's games, and it's actually is worth taking a look at, not just because children are unique from adults and have different interests and different limitations and things that they have to contend with, but also because children's online games have followed a very different trajectory from the general audience games. Now this is of course linked to this ongoing ebb and flow that I know everyone's aware of, even if you're not a gamer, of really heavily ideological, polarized discourses and controversies around kids and gaming and kids and technology generally. So, you have the highly condemnatory, looking video game play to mass murder, to the highly celebratory, and I'm so glad that Ron included that ad. Very, very typical, games for learning chocolate-covered broccoli. We're going to trick them all into getting these great vocabularies and solving the world's problems and curing cancer by playing games. So my book looks at these kinds of discourses, but there actually have been some analyses of the discourses and how they go back and forth. I want to push past that and look at what these discourses occupying our thoughts and attention around kids' games have actually done in terms of setting new standards and limitations on the design and development and management around kids' games as artifacts and as technologies and as spaces. So my book makes the case that both forces, even though they're arguing almost opposite things, are actually making a concurrent push towards a very highly instrumental vision of childhood, and a highly instrumentalized, very industrial, pro-capitalist vision of what constitutes as appropriate play. So this kind of links into both, whether you're arguing that appropriate play is playing with these tech games because they're going to trick you into learning math, or you're arguing that kids shouldn't be playing digital games because there's better games that they should be playing instead. Both are really privileging a highly purposive, outcome-driven vision of what play is. There's always a measurable outcome at the end that we're supposed to strive for, and in the meantime, things like fun and pleasure and just kind of cultural experience often get shut out completely. So this in turn has really deeply impacted the way in which children's games are designed. Developers are responding to these discourses, there's new laws that are brought in, lawsuits, policies, and just kind of public concern. And so there's all these different kinds of influences and standards that have emerged in terms of what's allowed within kids' games and what's not, and what types of standards have emerged around commercialization and the general acceptance of, well, commercialization as an okay trade-off. It means that the spaces are going to be safe and impart all these wonderful lessons and educational benefits. It's also distracted our attention as academics, as well as parents and policymakers, onto these moral panics and really extreme kind of visions of what's going on, and into making or arguing against broad essentialist statements about digital games as a concept, as a sort of vague technology, while the specifics of the games themselves often go unexamined. So increasingly, in the past couple of years, you've seen work that has focused more on games, and this is true like in work that Rhonda is doing and Adam are doing. So for instance, one of the reasons why they had to start so far back, is because there's a ton of educational claims made about these devices, but there's not very much research, if any, to actually back it up. So there's a lot of talk, but there's not actually a lot of research that looks at affordances and content and that kind of thing. So I do that type of work. I look at contents and design and systems and structures and policies and how those all go into the shaping of children's online games as a technology. For those of you who are familiar with Scott, you've probably picked out that that's the theoretical framework I'm coming from. But I do critical theory of technology, which is a vision, I keep saying vision when I mean version of Scott that focuses specifically on power relations and politics and economics, the very things that Scott traditionally was critiqued as sort of leaving out. So I see my work as really critical theory of technology plus political economy of communication, and to that I'm focusing on play theory. Not just because I'm interested in games and kids play, but I'm also interested in how we can use play theory to advance work that's being done, very compelling, interesting work that's being done in political economy and STS about the instrumentalization of things like online interaction, but to move away from thinking of it solely in labor terms. So I've been looking at this actual design, the broader politics that have led to the emergence of a highly rationalized set of standards and expectations around kids and gaming. My big argument in the book is that the proliferation of these standards, these politics, the ones I mentioned, are having a profound impact on the shape and contents of children's play. So not just on the spaces, but what's allowed within the spaces, and it's actually changing children's play. And it doesn't mean that it's like this completely prescriptive, we can limit what kids do, but what ends up happening is that all of the subversive creative energies have to be targeted to discovering workarounds and finding ways to actually communicate and make, generate culture within these spaces. And then that has a similarly reductionist effect on what kids can actually do in the spaces and how they play. So how this connects up with this larger process of trying to connect critical theory of technology and political economy and play theory is I want to connect this to a larger process that I really see as having started unfolding with industrialization. It has definite parallels with other systems of social rationalization like bureaucratization, instrumentalization, and commercialization, but I think it's its own process as well, and it needs to be understood on its own terms. So some sort of rationalization of play that occurred alongside work in these other types of areas of social life, but that has its own history and its own way of being understood. So I don't like talking about play in terms of immaterial labor because I find it really takes away a lot of the interesting things about what's going on. And the same with labor. There's too much of an emphasis on labor, and it's interesting, and it's been the only vocabulary I've had, but I'm trying to work on a new framework for understanding what that is. So that's the book. Can you tell I've been really deep into it? And that's the me avoiding rambling. But I just kind of want to give a quick update on some of the other projects that I'm working on, including the work I'm doing at Semaphore. So we're still working, Alice and Harvey and I are still working on Adaptive Games and Inclusive Play project, which is looking at some of the same things that I just mentioned, actually, in terms of how games are designed in ways that are very normative and exclusionary of types of playing that might be necessary for kids who have different types of disabilities. And so we're looking at ways of intervening in that, ways that players are already intervening. We have a big project underway with the Able Gamers Foundation in the US, and they're going to be coming up here in November to install an Able Gamer Arcade in the Semaphore Lab, which has a variety of different types of systems, and they're accessible to a variety of different play types, so a variety of different players with a variety of different disabilities will be able to play them. And with that, we're hoping to build ongoing relationships with community members who might want to participate in very participatory, qualitative type of research onto like what can we do to make game consoles more accessible, and what can we do to make games more accessible, game software. I just want to show, we have some logos that we're just unveiling today. The second project I'm working on that's very related to this is Playing at Making, and this is looking specifically, for those of you who've been to one of these adjunct professor research days, you know that I've been working for quite a while looking at UGC games, so games that allow kids to create some of the content. So my book looked at these 10 years of games becoming increasingly restrictive, while the technologies could enable a lot of creative input and collaboration in terms of shaping the space. And then with the advent of UGC games, I thought this is going to be different. Kids will be able to design their own spaces, and it's going to really open things up. And so I wanted to really track this trend and see how the tools were being designed and whether kids were being given opportunities that they were being shut out of in other aspects of children's adult culture. So this is ongoing. I'm just going to, it's not all hopeful. Obviously, a lot of the same companies who are involved in other aspects of game design are also involved in creating some of the most popular UGC games for kids, where the public face is all about play, create, share, but their actual policies around users' intellectual property is really about thwarting infringement and encouraging creativity in as much as you can then claim ownership of the IP and a lot of the same types of things as Nicole mentioned earlier in relation to publishing. Today we have some interesting things on the go with the Grand project that might not just be about looking at tools that exist, but perhaps developing a prototype of what a tool set would look like that really did allow flexibility and creativity. And it's so in the preliminary stages, I don't even know what to say about it yet. But hopefully after this third project, we'll have a better sense of how to proceed. So the third project, and this is the one I'm going to be talking about right now, is the Kids DIY Media Project. And again, for those of you who've been to these before, the last junior professor research day, I talked about this as being my dream of what I wanted to do in the future in my research. So to bring together all these experts and academics and policymakers to talk about kids DIY media and what was happening. Because out of my work on UGC games, there was just so many parallels to other media forms. And as a person who does have interest in children's media generally and not just games, despite all evidence to the contrary, I thought it would be very beneficial to work with other people who are looking at different types of media, different types of tool sets that are being provided, so we could look at some of these similarities and differences and maybe start to work on some actual deliverables that might make a difference. So these were praxis-oriented deliverables, such as like policy recommendations for the privacy commissioner, or best practices recommendations for how do you design a tool set for kids that enables them to be flexible and have at least some degree of freedom of expression, but that also fulfills your requirements to not put them in danger or expose them to content that will immediately get your website shut down by the police, which is obviously a big concern. You can let your imaginations run wild and imagine what that might be. So this was my dream a couple of years ago, and then we got funding to actually do it, so now I'm trying to make it happen, which is amazing. And they're going to be the topic of the next few minutes. So what I decided to do to talk about the project was to use one of the tools that we're looking at in the project, and it's a tool that's developed by one of the partners in our project. So this is Storyboard, which is an online... It's an online website where kids or adults or whoever really likes picture books can write and design their own picture book. All of the artwork is professionally provided. They're looking into ways of allowing users to submit their artwork for consideration, but it's all licensed appropriately. So if you want to use it on an online version, the artists have given permission for users to come in and make a story using their artwork. Where they make money from this otherwise free site is if you want to publish the book. And so then how much money you actually have to spend to publish the book in either soft copy or hard copy includes the portion that would go to the artist, and that's actually a significant portion of the overall cost, as well as the cost of printing and a little bit of money for the creators of the site itself. One of the other really cool things about Storyboard, and you'll see a little bit more about what it looks like in a second, they got involved in this project because they were, first of all, they obviously have a tool set for kids to create their own content and share it online, but they were, from the get-go, extremely interested in tackling some of these larger issues around how we envision childhood, where do we allow kids to have freedom of expression, how do you deal with these issues. And so they were not only a great partner, but they also, because they were interested in these issues from the get-go, have developed some fairly unique strategies so far. They have more work to do in Canada, and that's why they're involved in the project. But for instance, instead of just censoring kids' content outright, which often is how it works, you use a bad word, your thing is not getting published. And it doesn't matter what the context is. If you use a swear word, it's just off. Or if you use copyrighted images, it's taken down. Is that they actually review all of the submissions and provide feedback to the authors. So they often get classes of children who are forced to use the tool, right, to write a story in class, and they'll always get one or two who will just kind of write, and so what they do is, even in these cases, and it's kind of amazing what's been happening, is they give them editorial feedback. So instead of using the F word, which we're not allowed to publish on our site, you might think of expressing your anger in other ways. I'm making it up, but that is what they do. They give them actual feedback, and they do take it seriously, and it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but they actually treat the authors with respect. And the number of these, little silly acts of rebellion that actually turn into real stories is, I think they said, over 80%. So they found that they're actually reaching out to resistant, struggling, kids who don't actually want to be involved in this, or might have, they're afraid of expressing themselves as kind of a forum. Once taken seriously, actually, there can be more dialogue, and they can, very often actually engage in the creative process with them. So they're taking it seriously, and they're not just providing, a Band-Aid solution, and they're taking the moderation seriously. It obviously takes up a lot of man-hours, but this is sort of the kind of thing you need to do if you're going to really espouse a child-centric, rights-based approach to letting kids communicate online. Because really that's what it is. Because the vast majority of sites for kids don't let them, and they have all kinds of structures in place to prevent them from communicating, or to prevent them from communicating about certain subjects. So this is a little storybook that I made for you guys about our project. So this is the rationale, and this is all artwork from a single artist. You can see the name of it at the bottom, is Pixel Pop. So it's all about kids making media. They make art, they make crafts, they write stories. These are long-standing traditions in kids' culture, and we know that they do this. Traditionally, though, these things have happened at home or at school, in private and local contexts, and they were largely shared with just a few people, friends and teachers and family. Now, for many years, Coppa, which is Children's Online Privacy Protection Act in the States, which had a lot of impact on Canada as well, and a variety of different kind of reactions to the two dynamics that I was just talking about, had this strange effect on what was going on online in terms of the availability of tools that allow kids to create and share their own content. So there was customization of content. There were gated places that were classroom specific, or a teacher would get a license and then the kids could communicate within that space. So that celebratory kind of let's emphasize the educational value. The alone creation, where you can create but not share, as well as just kind of these, taking the opportunities out altogether, because you don't want to have to bother with the intense amount of moderation that it takes to run a kid's site where they're allowed to communicate, and you're not going to get sued or get in trouble with legislators or other entities. But over the past few years, this has been shifting, and now there are an increasing number of websites, programs, and services that do provide kids with forums for producing, and they're advertising it, and it's become like a big fad and trend, and people are very excited about it, and they're getting all kinds of funding from the MacArthur Foundation to help kids develop 21st century skills, et cetera, et cetera. So it's become its own kind of a fad, and a lot of people are claiming to provide this without fully, actually providing it, or without having thought through these larger issues that are involved. So some of the forums are nonprofit, and this has always been the case, but most are commercially owned and operated. And some of them do provide these really amazing, easy-to-use tools. I'm using Storyboard because a lot of what I say is very critical, but I ultimately do believe in the possibilities here. I think with the right affordances and the right people involved, they can be quite amazing for opening up spaces, opening up the democratization of media making to children, which they haven't been included in until now, at least not to any large extent, as well as kids who might otherwise be excluded from more specialized, expensive forms of media production. So it has a lot of positive implications for the advancement of children's cultural rights. I have one of them here, which is in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Article 13 is all about freedom of expression. It's often overlooked. There are lots of laws that actually supersede this, but it is 13th in terms of what we thought was important for children's rights. And even though it's not respected very widely, there still are ongoing movements to try to promote this and get kids more involved in media making. And of course, learning and skill development. I'm not as focused on that. I'm always more focused on play and leisure, and in this case, creativity and expressing yourself. But a lot of my partners are going to be studying those aspects. And really, if we have more voices involved in media production, we'll get a more diverse media landscape, and that would be great, especially in the kids' media landscape, because it does tend to be quite homogenous. Children's mass media was historically dominated by adults, and so this is a huge change. And all of the existing infrastructures, all the policies, all the laws around authorship, around how to deal with kids online, are all built from this perspective that the content is going to be created by adults and that the kids are going to be users or consumers. So there's very little in terms of language to draw on that tells you how to treat a kid as a producer or as an author. I mentioned this at a previous talk. There are parallels that can be drawn with child athletes and child actors. Special laws that were brought into place because these people were making lots of money or were being taken out of school, and big decisions were being made. But in terms of like these very mundane practices where there's very little, if any, money involved, no one's making $1 million movie out of this yet. Most of them aren't necessarily things that will ever get to that point. But they're still entering into these types of relationships. So they're still signing over authorship rights to companies. They're still entering into commercial contracts. They're still engaging in fair use, but being told that it's copyright infringement. So they're engaging in a lot of these relationships, but the infrastructure isn't there. So some of the sites are more adamant about trying to implement those old structures than others. As I said, Storyboard, and other examples like it, have tried to grapple with this lack of guidance about what do we do. We need to figure out a way to respect the child author. We're just going to write it in. It might not be legally binding, but we're going to say, we respect your ownership over your own intellectual property, and there are great examples of sites that have done that. But for the vast majority, they're using the cookie cutter. You have to be 18 or older to use this site that's clearly targeted to 6-year-olds, or we will claim all of your IP forever throughout the universe, the language that you guys have seen before. So this movement and this big fad to allow kids to create content online, and obviously there's a huge response huge response to this from kids themselves. They've flocked to these sites. They've made millions and millions of games and millions of storyboards. It ties in very well with existing practices within children's culture. So there's all these unresolved issues that remain, and kids and parents are dealing with it on their own. I mentioned how the developers are being left to deal with it on their own, and that's where our project hopes to make an intervention. So here we come, Kids Media Project, DIY Media Project, a cross-sector partnership composed of academics, children's website, and media producers, as well as child advocacy groups, policymakers, educators, and not right now, but starting next year, some media makers, children who are media makers who are evaluated by their peers to be representative of like a good, successful media maker, which is going to be very fun to identify. The partnership was formed to bring together all of these key stakeholders that we saw, people who were engaging in these discussions and who had opinions, who had frontline experience dealing with some of these issues, whether they were dealing with them in a de facto status quo way, or we're trying to come up with innovative solutions. We wanted to bring all these people together to kind of talk about the issues, talk about what research needs to be done to try to figure out solutions, and engage in cross-sector discussion and engage the public in public consultations. So these are the people who are currently in the partnership. We have a number of other people who are joining. The additional partners are predominantly children's media producers, and some of them are fairly well known. I guess I should say, I really wanted to focus first and foremost on people who are already doing innovative and ethical things, which often came out of the independent game development community and media tool development communities. So like Storyboard, they're not owned by Disney. They're their own people. They're an indie, and they have time and are also allowed, because they don't have a lot of legal department of 80 people telling them they're not allowed to do anything outside the box, which is great. But they're also being excluded from some of the larger corporately focused consortiums that are taking place. The policy statement on intellectual property that Disney and Viacom and all those giants signed a couple of years ago. The indies aren't included in those discussions, and so it kind of served as a double justification for making sure we started with them first. So it's been the same for then we approached public media, and now we're going out to the larger corporate media who are okay with being on equal ground with these other players. Our goal is to come up with deliverables that reflect the partnership and that kind of respond to needs that exist, kind of across the partnership. So academic papers, obviously, but also policy recommendations, as I mentioned, an industry best practices document, educator guides, as well as information and literacy projects for kids. And we have a bunch of specialists who are working on the project. We're going to aim it at kids of different ages, and it's going to be really fun to write the wording for how to explain fair use to a 6-year-old. But you know what? I don't think it's as hard as Disney and others would have you believe it is. And all of these deliverables are aimed at promoting a rights-based, inclusive approach to supporting kids' DIY media online. So it's a 3-year project. We're still in year 1. What we've been doing since June here and at Utah State, which is where the main academic partners is situated, is working to review the relevant literature, survey the landscape, how many of these tools we're talking about, what do they look like, how are they targeted, what kind of language are they using, and that type of thing, and gather preliminary data on those sites that exist and the tools that are currently available, both commercial and non-commercial. The next thing that we're working towards is an advisory meeting with all of our partners, which is going to happen in February. And then in April, we're doing our first public outreach at the 2014 TIFF Kids Film Festival. And then we'll continue with data analysis and prepping for year 2, which is going to be pretty intense. So what we found so far, we spent 3 months looking for examples of tools that were available on the World Wide Web. So we are going to look across other platforms later. We want to start with the internet, as browser-based, kind of computer-based internet. And we looked for examples of sites that were marketed and directed to children aged 12 and under that were currently live, so they couldn't have existed 8 years ago, and everyone has a great memory of them. We had to actually be able to see them. And were available in English, and that's a way of limiting the scope, I guess, but also there were some obvious reasons for that. We looked across media formats, so we didn't look specifically, and we really tried to open our minds. Would a recipe count as media? And DIY types, so we looked at fan fiction, movies, and all kinds of things. So we're looking really for websites that allow kids to not just make stuff, but also share it. So whatever their strategy was for how to deal with that those 2 things had to exist. And our preliminary findings, it's really, we're still doing a data analysis. We still have a ton of analysis to do. But the first and most shocking one was that there weren't as many as we thought. Yet again, hype has tricked me. There were only 250 sites that met this very basic criteria. I was expecting, 4,000. The way it sounded, so many. And then we're going to have to limit our sample. But there were only 250, and so we're just going to look at all of them, because that's not a big sample size. There's much more emphasis on making than sharing. There were thousands of additional sites that allowed kids to download something and make it, but not share their creation. So that was really the clincher, was, it's easy to find a site that'll encourage kids to make movies, but it's very hard to find a site that'll actually screen them or let you watch them. The tools provided tend to be quite limited. There was lots of content behind paywalls. We have had some very interesting discussions about this. We'll give you guys 3 crayons, but if you pay us $1, we'll give you 5 crayons to make your picture, the equivalent of that. as well as a suggestion of some very troubling gender differences if the site is targeted to girls, far fewer affordances. And this actually, I'm looking at gender right now, and it reminds me of Star Hall, similar things that we've found in a previous study as well. So I can't wait to tell you all about more of the findings once we finish the analysis, and thank you for listening to my last talk and being all here and engaged. That was really awesome, and thank you very much.
I'm really interested in the value of sharing the content for these children under the age of 12. One of the reasons I'm interested in it is that the concept that a child could abstractly understand the notion that something they're making is given to the plethora of children or other people out there on the internet, right? So they understand that they share an object to their family members, their parents, to the classroom, but then the sort of fuzzy idea of their object being out there, to what extent are they understanding that they're sharing it, and what value does that create? I'm curious about how you sort of approach that idea.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think very many adults have much of a grasp on sharing their content. I don't know if that helps, but in terms of the sharing and contributing to a shared culture, there's definitely a lot in the children's rights, cultural rights discourses that have a lot of justification for that. In terms of the beneficial outcomes, even though I spent like the first 10 minutes saying, I'm not gonna talk about that, but okay, so there are beneficial outcomes in terms of, feeling like, feeling scaffolded, feeling like you're contributing, feeling a sense of agency, all the kinds of cultural capital that can come out of that, as well as things that are more in tune with affinity spaces, situated learning, that kind of thing. Which actually Debbie, who's one of the partners in the project, it's really the aspect that she's focused on is what kids get out of that in terms of their social development, as well as how it feeds back into education and things that they're doing in the school context. So having that sense of mastery, the ability to become a mentor to another kid your age, how that makes you see yourself and how it makes you see your own input, and the confidence that can give you, and then how you can bring that into other aspects of your life. So that's the kind of thing that she's looking at. For me, I like to stick with the rights discourse, and just, shared culture is a huge part of kids' culture. It's huge. I mean, in kids' play, they refer to shared cultural artifacts and characters all the time, and that, study after study has found the predominance of those kinds of characters and themes in kids' play, in their imaginary talk, and in their own creations, stories that they write, and the pictures that they draw. The ability to actually have an impact on what that shared culture looks like, a phenomenal opportunity. I can see what you're getting at, and I think that that's part of the reason why there should be particular ways of approaching it so that a kid can always withdraw. If they realize a year later, oh no, everyone can see my stupid drawing I did when I was 6 and I was terrible at drawing, and now I'm 7, I'm way better, and I want that to disappear forever. That should definitely be part of, and it will be part of the recommendations that we make, that you can always withdraw consent. That's not currently there, of course, but to try to account for shifting realizations of what public really means. That answer.
Is your storyboard presentation moderated? Did you say poo-poo in it?
I didn't. Why would you assume that?
I was assuming. I was asking.
No.
Yeah, I think we'll draw to a close now. I want to thank everybody. It was a fantastic day. The talks across the board were just absolutely amazing, and I think we were all of us who sat in the audience and heard them all.